Let's go. Hi everyone and welcome to the Curious Geographer. Lots of you here tuned in, which is fantastic. Today we are joined by Dr. Simon Oakes, who probably has influenced your geography education in some way. He has authored lots of A-level books, which are really useful. It's the Hodder's Geography Topic Masters, and also is an associate editor of Geography Review magazine, which I know a lot of my A-level students really like reading. He has also works as a chief examiner, curriculum designer, has taught, I think it's for 30 years in schools and university teaching. Simon can kind of expand on that. And also works with the RGS. So super like knowledgeable and kind of really focuses on globalization and changing places. So today we are going to discuss how coronavirus is impacting these places. So Simon, if you would just like to quickly, I mean, I've given you a bit of an introduction, but just like for the moment, just kind of say who you are and what you currently do would be great.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks so much for having me on. And if anyone, those of you who are actually watching as well, thank you for coming out to watch us have our little conversation. That was a lovely introduction. It's true that I'm responsible for bits of some of the books you read and the curriculums you take. I've worked for a long time as an author, as a curriculum writer, as senior chief chair of examiners. But first and foremost, I'm a geography teacher. I have taught on and off for over 25, 30 years, including a stint for 4 years at Middlesex University, where I was doing undergraduate geography teaching, based in the Flood Hazard Research Department, which is where I did a PhD on globalisation and changing places, all kind of linked up together. That was nearly 20 years ago now. Currently, I'm not teaching at the moment, which may or may not be a blessing. You'll know more about what it's like in the classroom than me, Ellie, at the moment. It does sound like you guys are doing a fantastic job, though, keeping it all going. So yes, that's me, and I've recently authored a series of textbooks, the Hodder Topic Master ones. Go out and get a class set. That would be my advice. So yes, that's me.
That's good advice. I think they're particularly, I mean, I've used a lot of the globalization one and the changing places one, and very good for all specs. So if you do want something to extend, particularly evaluative writing, I feel that's really good for that.
Well, I loved writing those because they weren't just tied to one of the specifications. You could really get into the big ideas behind the geography, which is what I liked.
Just before we start as well, just a note to everybody watching, if there are any questions when you come up, when you're listening to things, please just write them in the comments and then we'll try and get to them as well. So if we start with places, COVID-19 has certainly changed places in a variety of ways. How has kind of coronavirus changed different places? Has it changed it so much to the extent that some of what we're learning is irrelevant and we almost need like a new course of what places mean to people?
That is a great question to start us off on. A killer question, Ellie. You could argue, yes, couldn't you? When has anything happened since the Second World War and the Blitz that is changed both real places and also our feelings about places? Which and I think the way I'll handle your question is the A-level curriculum has got these two aspects, one of which is the actual economic and demographic geography of local places, but then you've got this whole sort of area of quite advanced, almost undergraduate geography about place meanings, representations, and feelings. So we've got these two areas of the curriculum we could think about. And yeah, these are big changes. And they're big changes that are exactly what we're supposed to study as geographers. One of the big conceptual ideas behind changing places, whether you're doing AQA, EdXL, OCR, WJC, you know who you are, whatever your course, the big thing you're supposed to be understanding is the way that local places are just shaped and continually reshaped over time by connections with other places, and that nowhere is an island anymore, particularly in a global economy, a globalized world. Everything is interrelated. So we've seen this external pandemic just locking down places, keeping people at home, closing businesses, but also opening up some new opportunities as well. So yeah, there's a big argument that we're going to have to really rethink the curriculum, I suppose. I don't know whether we have to fundamentally change, but all the students who are watching, you'll know that your courses always say you need to study how places are affected by external changes, such as the global financial crisis, or such as, and obviously the next set of specifications are going to have COVID or the pandemic in every single one of those such as suggestions, because it's so big. Um, the themes that off the top of my head strike me that we're really going to be looking at are, well, firstly, just the huge impact on retail and footfall. Some of the projections for the number of businesses that might go out of that might cease trading over the next year are quite scary. I think what COVID has done is it's accelerated a lot of processes that were already happening, almost to a step change or a tipping point. So we knew that people were gradually shifting to online retail. We knew that businesses and offices and schools and colleges might gradually migrate to online learning. But these were seen as very long-term processes that might take a decade or more, that would be gradual and incremental, because there's a lot of institutional obduracy to change. People like myself, if somebody had said to me, would you like to start doing all of your teaching online from home? I would have said, no, that sounds like a really horrible, abrupt change. But it's change that's now happened and been forced. And what seems to have happened is a lot of people have woken up to the fact that they quite like working from home. Guess what? You can work all day with your pajama bottoms on and no one can tell below the desk. I am wearing, I am dressed, don't worry. And there's just so much that you has just been pushed forward by this technology that suddenly people who were resistant are going, actually, I quite like working from home. I like studying from home. It's overcome inequalities as well. I've been doing some online events with the Royal Geographical Society where I used to go to London and talk to 25 or 30 teachers. And we've had to move them online because the teachers aren't allowed into the Royal Geographical. But then the first one we did, I had 70 teachers instead of 25, and they were from all around the country. So there was no longer that, oh, you can only go to that if you're in the south of England. It opened up access. So we've got all of that going on. And what we don't know is whether people who got used to working from home and studying from home are going to want to go back into towns or cities or not. So I read somewhere that footfall in London is still 16% of what it was at the start of the pandemic, and that's one of the reasons that the Johnson administration were really keen to get office workers back, and they were saying, "Come on, do it for your country. You need to get back to the office." Is because of the multiplier effect from that. Nobody's going to work in the city of London, so all the little coffee baristas and all of the sandwich shops and the Pretts, they can't sell anything. So could this fundamentally take some towns and cities to a tipping point? Will it profoundly change some of the shopping malls and the town centres that people watching this, you're using as your case studies? Are they still going to be there in a year or two's time? We don't know. Another thing that's happening is it going to lead to a new wave of what's called counter-urbanisation? At the moment, in the current changing places specs, that's seen as very much a historical thing that happened back in the 70s, 1970s and the 80s, back when urban living wasn't very fashionable. A lot of people moved to the countryside, particularly families with young children. They were moving out of the cities. They were worried about the crime, the deindustrialisation. This is back in that era of global shift. And that has more or less stopped and reversed in the 90s and into the noughties. There's this new wave of urbanisation. Cities are re-imaged and they're rebranded, and suddenly everybody wants to live there again. Now that's suddenly stopped, and you can, students watching this, you can go and read some really interesting articles in The Economist and the Financial Times, where a lot of people are saying, are people going to leave the cities? Are cities going to empty out? Are we going to have ghost cities? Does everybody now want to live in a suburb or a semi-rural area in what's called a 15-minute city, where you can just get to the local shops and your school and you're going to work from home? Are we going to get hollowed out cities? It's really, for a geographer, it's actually quite exciting, because we're looking at one of those step changes in urban geography and in changing places where processes, as I've said, that were incremental are suddenly changing. However, and I'm going to shut up in a minute and chuck this over to see if anyone who's listening wants to talk about it. We also have to, as geographers, think about scale, which is that as I said, London's got 16% footfall, but I read somewhere that some of the smaller towns and cities, Bolton, Bradford, they're back to 100% footfall. So there seems to be something going on where maybe some of the big metropolis, London, Greater Manchester, maybe these will hollow out a bit with a lot of people working from home. Maybe some of the smaller towns and cities are going to get back to their equilibrium state again. And history has, people have been living in cities for 6,000 years. There's been many pandemics and plagues and wars and all sorts of things that have driven people out of cities. And do you know what? They've always come back again. They've always been drawn back to the energy that comes from agglomerations and multipliers and cumulative causation, all these things you learn about in geography. There are good reasons why businesses cluster together that energy that comes from it. But then we've never had the internet working quite as well as we're doing right now on this Skype call. We've never had that technology before. So maybe this is the time that cities and towns don't come back from the brink of people filtering out. So that's my thoughts about what's going to happen to places physically, I suppose. I'd like to talk about place meanings and feelings for a minute, but shall I just hold back and see if anyone's got any questions about that bit?
Well, yeah, well, so if people have, I mean, I have a question, but if anybody else, can you just write them down and we'll get to them? There's a slight lag time, so they'll listen to this and then they'll write, but we'll come back to the questions. I thought it was really interesting about potentially how like coronavirus is accelerating certain trends. So, for example, think about that high street. I mean, we even taught it last, like a couple in the spec when we look at changing places, how high streets aren't necessarily always used for shopping areas, but maybe used for areas of activity. If there's like a pool table area, just to kind of bring that footfall if people aren't going to the high street to do their shopping, and so therefore how those trends of, say, people not visiting the high street, that might even be like accelerated further with coronavirus. But it was maybe like a trend that was happening already. And then linking back to the scale, that London is quite interesting. Where, I don't know what, I've forgotten the other name of the place. Where did you compare it to? Bradford?
Yeah, Bradford, Oldham, some of the smaller towns and cities, Midlands and the North, where they've got regular shopping footfall. I live in Cardiff, and apparently the high street is business as usual today in Cardiff, which is interesting. But it's a small city of just 300,000 people. Cardiff. It's the size of one London borough.
Do you think that's to do with public transport, or do you think it's the size?
Well, I think in Cardiff, most people can still just jump into their little cars and get to work in 10 minutes. In London, all those commuting patterns that are built up, where people have got used to being on a crowded public transport with their face in somebody's armpit, for an hour and a half, just perfect conditions to pass a disease around. There's going to be such reticence among a lot of people to go back into that pattern until they're absolutely sure that they're not going to pick up COVID on the underground, I'd have thought, or on Network Southeast. Which is why, as geographers, we can really think, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, where we're going to be saying, oh, yes, COVID killed cities, COVID killed urban living. As geographers, we're better than that. And we would be saying, well, let's look at the settlement hierarchy. And maybe there's and the nature of settlements before they started, as you've said. You've really got to look and say, what was the condition of this settlement, this place, prior to the pandemic? Was it somewhere that was slowly turning into charity shops? Was it re-imaging itself really successfully with music and bars and clubs? But that's all it had, and that sector's just been wiped out. So there's no resilience there at all. Music industry venues look like loads of them are just, that is a tipping point. They're permanently closed. So I think it'll be very interesting for all students, teachers, and schools to really look at what happens to their local place and to see if it's a resilient place that is able to move with the times, or whether structurally, if you look at its economy, you look at what it was dependent on the eve of COVID, was it a very vulnerable place that has been pushed to a tipping point? It was gradually getting there, and this has pushed it over. And was it something that people thought was a successfully re-imaged place? But it turns out that re-imaging, as I say, with clubs, are very much a club music theatre driven economy. That is in a terrible state now. And I'm sure that the people who are listening will be reflecting on their own nearest large key settlement as to whether they think the evidence is there that it was a vulnerable place or a resilient place.
And just to highlight to all our A-level students, the the use of like kind of synoptic terms that you're using as well, and like concepts to understand that. So you've talked a lot about resilience and like vulnerability, and that is kind of woven in throughout the A-level specs. So just to kind of like point to students on how you're using those words, it's really good to actually use these to like understand how places are being impacted and changing, or if they are changing, and how they're coping.
Thanks. Yes, I've been very subtly slipping those in as much as possible. So
You're so
I'm
subtle.
glad
I'm
you
just
noticed.
telling everybody to learn how you're saying it so they can also use it in their exams as well to show good understanding. Um, so the second part you were going to talk about was
Yeah,
about more kind of place meanings, instead of like the
yeah.
characteristics. Would you like to tell us about that part?
Well, I think that's the other part of changing places, and that's the bit that is very interesting about the A-level geography courses. Those of you who are studying it now, you won't know this, but until about 3-4 years ago, nobody had ever taught place meanings and feelings and experiences at A-level geography. So all of your teachers did a bit of a double take when they saw the new syllabus and said, I'm teaching what? But we've all worked out now that this is quite a big part of what gets taught at A-level because it feeds into university geography courses. That's why it was introduced. So this sort of second area of changing places, which is very subjective and feels a bit more like you're doing art or art history or something where you're thinking about place experiences and feelings and meanings and what it's like to belong to a place. And of course, COVID and the idea of a pandemic, and I think has fundamentally made us very suspicious of place. Um, I, Everyone listening can probably reflect on the first time after that initial lockdown when nobody went out for 2 weeks. So we all had this experience of seeing the streets with no cars in them, and experiencing what life might have been like back in the 1950s and 60s when cities were a lot quieter. Uh, and then that first time you go out and see the face masks and get this real sense as I am living through a modern plague. This is amazing. So, and certain segments of society are still scared to go out. They're genuinely scared that if they're in a vulnerable group, that they're going to contract the pandemic. So there's this idea there's various ideas in geography, different sorts of landscape, that there are what are called ecoscapes and ethnoscapes and technoscapes. There's a whole vocabulary of landscapes, and there is an interesting one that doesn't get used very much that I think will a lot now, which is the idea of a fearscape, which is that you suddenly begin to perceive that the urban area outside your house is full of danger messages and warning messages and big signs saying you've got to wash your hands, wear a mask. There's tape everywhere. I live opposite a park where half the tape, the benches when you go have still got that yellow sort of murder don't cross like police tape stuck across them. So you can't go out and lose yourself in nature anymore because every park bench you walk past has got these signs, these signifiers that you are living through a very scary, dangerous time, and you mustn't sit down in case you get this terrible disease. You go on a train and half the seats are cordoned off. So we're living through this really interesting time of experiencing place in quite a fearful and scary way. And and as geographers, you've always got to think beyond the initial cliche and say, well, actually, it's not like that for everybody. For younger people who maybe feel more resilient and feel safer because younger people know that they're less likely to contract it or suffer ill effects. For younger people, that perception of space may not have changed. For younger people, they're just annoyed that everything is shut down. But for older people and people with health conditions, they're genuinely having to navigate urban space and rural space as well, feeling perhaps a little bit scared. And there's some very interesting ideas there. I'd love to see some NEAs dealing with this. I think for kids who are thinking, how can I engage with COVID as part of my NEA if they're in year 12, obviously you can go and do a survey of all the shops that have shut down. And you can have an NEA which is to what extent has COVID affected my local place. The answer is going to be a lot. Spoiler, that will be what you'll find out if you just go and look at things have shut down. That's what you'll find out. But wouldn't it be interesting to do some some quite interesting qualitative work, doing some in-depth interviews with younger and older people, finding about how their geographies have changed and how they stopped going out as much and were scared of going to some places. I do mark some NEAs sometimes, and I would love to see work like that in a year or two's time. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that might be, if we've struggled to introduce place feelings and meanings to the A-level curriculum because it's been new, and there's new subjects sometimes have to find their way into the curriculum until people are comfy. I think the fact that future generations of learners coming through have all experienced this huge, shocking change is very rich ground for the curriculum, for exploring, for learners, what it's been like for them, how their own lives have connected with their local places. Maybe we might have some questions about that. The other thing I wanted to say, if I could, of course, is, and we were talking about this before we started, is I have a friend who's a geography teacher, everybody, who we were discussing whether or not we should have more COVID in the curriculum, because you're all living it, so wouldn't you want to link it with your geography studies? And he said, the last thing my students want to talk about in their geography is this stupid pandemic. They actually want to come to school and study volcanoes and earthquakes and stuff in geography where they don't have to think about this pandemic that is ruining life back in the real world, and actually they don't want to bring it into the curriculum. And maybe the idea of doing an NEA on the pandemic is the last thing you want to do. You'd rather do one on something completely disconnected, because then you don't have to think about it. I wonder what our listeners or your own students, Ellie, think about that. Whether do we want to talk about COVID more when we're doing Changing Places, or would we rather pretend it's 2019 and it hadn't happened?
So over to you, audience. I know hopefully some of my students are watching, but we have teachers and also students who are watching. So do you feel happy? Would you like to learn and study or write about coronavirus in terms of geography and the topics? Or is it a no, you'd prefer it just to, like, as a bit of a, like, school is not having to think about that real life the whole time? So yes, and a reason why, or no, but just like if you put down your reasons, it'd be great to hear what you think. So if everybody please could write a little comment, that'd be great. Whilst they're doing that, Simon, I will ask you the next question, and hopefully by then we'll have some comments.
Sure.
The sense of place and community attachment, do you think that because everybody's staying at home, less people are going to work, that sense of community is increasing for people and people having a higher place attachment?
Another great question, and another one for all those students listening, where the smart geography answer to that is, well, that very much depends on what sort of place you're talking about and at what kind of scale, because what kind of sense of place is materialised and community have you got in deserted parts of the city of London when nobody's gone back to work yet? Probably very different maybe from the sense of community you might have in some smaller towns and cities where people are living closer together, and maybe they've pulled together more. You know, there's always been that thing about the British, the so-called Dunkirk spirit, where we're all supposed to pull together in a crisis. Maybe some places, just by their geography, are places where it's easier for communities to pull together, because then they're not as dispersed with these big commuting patterns we've got in London. I think there's an awful lot of factors there. And again, it depends on what that community was like before COVID. Pre-COVID, was it a fragmented community that had divisions anyway, or was it quite a homogeneous community with a strong sense of community cohesion, which has only been strengthened? That said, we've got to think about those local sensitivities. I think we can observe that there has been, and I'm far from the only person that would have pointed this out, is that lockdown Mark 1, which was an unexpected shared experience, seemed to foster an incredible sense of community cohesion. We're all in this together. And, the clapping, the NHS clapping, that's a great case study for changing places, isn't it? So the idea that briefly all these local places around the country were being connected through this act of clapping. All these individual local actions escalated at a national scale. A national clap was going on every Tuesday night, and everyone was feeling we were in it together. That was being driven by state actions. The government, in terms of top-down, had this strong messaging that we must protect the NHS. And if you think about the scale of geography of this, that top-down action filtered down to local communities where local people came out in their streets and clapped for the NHS and sometimes collected money for it. A lot of bottom-up activity was going on. So that was a real multi-scalar sense of community cohesion, the state driving local communities. We're all in this together. You then fast forward into the dissolution period, where questions started being asked about how effective the top-down governance of this was, and a certain disillusionment began to set in, and skeptics began to question the science. And we then moved into a very contested phase where a lot of people began to resent this. And at that point, another one of these sort of binary identity divisions appeared that seem to be what we're living with at the moment. Brexit, Leaver, Remainer, globalist, localist, Trumpist, Bidenist, is that a word? I've made that up. But we live in a time of these interesting divisions built around culture and identity. And suddenly we seemed mid-lockdown, around June, July, to be, there's suddenly people saying, well, this isn't happening. I don't believe this is happening. COVID's just been made up by the lizard people. It's not really happening. It's Chinese plot. Suddenly the narrative changed. And communities became divided, and I started falling out with my dad regularly on the phone, as we do about Brexit. We began to fall out, my father and I, about this because he was saying, I've been reading the Daily Telegraph, and they're just saying the science have got it all wrong. We shouldn't be trying to save the NHS. I want to go out. I was saying, but Dad, you're 80, you're vulnerable, you've got to stay in. He said, I don't care. And I found within my own family setting, suddenly, we thought we'd had cohesion, but it actually began to divide. And I think we have reached that point now where, as geographers trying to analyse what's going on, it started out simple, but it's become really complicated. And possibly, we do not have the community cohesion we thought we did. And you can see the government now struggling to message in a coherent way to try and bring us all together again. But again, it's huge generalizations. Your listeners will know whether they're living in local areas where there's still a really strong positive response and people are out collecting money, trying to support the NHS. Children in Need was great, wasn't it? That seemed to bring it all together again.
Yeah.
Again, that's a national thing, linking with the local.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like, so like that start, there was that kind of big push. So everybody on where I live on like the street, everybody got a street WhatsApp, and like everybody was on it. Whereas previously, like we didn't really know, like if you just moved in, like who lived where. So I kind of feel like building that community, there was almost like that kickstart. So we got Harry, who's had a comment saying, surely sense of place will be lost due to everyone being stuck at home. What do you think about that, Simon?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? We could argue, couldn't we, that there have always been people who've been stuck at home, the elderly, those with mobility problems, women and young new dads with young children. There's a lot of people in society. Harry, you and your friends, it might be the first time you've experienced, rather than your boundaries getting bigger as you get older, suddenly being locked back down again. But actually, for people in different demographic cohorts other than those of students, a lot of us have experienced this before in some ways. I barely left the house for 2 years when my first kid was born because he just stayed up and kept us awake every night. He was one of those babies that doesn't sleep. And we were just stuck in for 2 years. Tom Jones, the singer, said that he was stuck in his house for 2 years with tuberculosis when he was 18. I saw him talking about that on his 80th birthday program. So there have always been people who've been, for various reasons, not been able to engage. A load of people have had to go out. NHS key workers have gone out. Your teachers have gone out. You've probably gone out since you've gone back to school. So yes and no. It obviously curtails some people's freedom, but I think once you start analysing this and breaking it down and thinking about different perspectives, how this might be seen from different groups in society, I don't think it will necessarily kill the sense of place. And as I was saying before, people are resilient. you might have grandparents or great grandparents who lived in this country who lived through the Blitz when houses in their street were blowing up, and we climbed back from that. What I do want to say that comes brilliantly off your question, Harry, is that what has happened, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, hopefully, if Ellie prompts me to move towards globalisation. What has happened that is magic is we have seen whole new senses of place spreading through the internet. Now, I watched, like you might have done, some very interesting news reports trying to work out why a load of people rocked up to Bristol and threw a statue of an old bloke into the harbour because something had happened to somebody in America where there'd been a police shooting, and that somehow these things were connected. And the whole Black Lives Matter phenomenon is a global community building that is linking into local place histories. It's getting certain people in Bristol angry and out on the streets throwing statues in the bay. Because under lockdown, we talked about this earlier, Ellie, the step changes. We've seen a step change in social media use and people connecting, social movements connecting like never before, precisely because people have been stuck in and they're spending more screen time than ever. So once you start digging around under the surface, what looks like quite simple, quite a reasonable assumption to make is that there's no sense of place anymore because we're all stuck in it. Actually, there's some quite complex and nuanced things that are happening out there as well.
Just while we're here, and yes, I will prompt you to go on to the next one. We actually had some replies about whether students would be interested in studying it at school, and the majority.
Hit, miss, or maybe. What are we going to
The majority are a thumbs up, saying would like to learn it. Some have said maybe a later time, looking back at it. A very topical issue from Sophia. If I'd started my NEA later, I would have definitely tried to incorporate it into the study. I find it really interesting. I think from Becky, using coronavirus as an example or case study would be helpful for future generations to see what we felt about the virus and thought about it. So mostly our audience currently at the moment are saying like yes to learning about it. Obviously that's not everybody, but if anybody else does have any comments on that, please just write them down. And then we've just got.
Can I just pick up on what one of them said, actually? I'm not sure whether it was Becky or one of the other names you mentioned, but whoever it was who said something about maybe there needs to be a little bit of a time. I think somebody said something about maybe not just have a little bit of time. That is quite a good point, isn't it? Which is that do we need to have a time for emotional distancing? Because if we've got students in the country who've lost a grandparent or maybe even a parent in some cases to COVID, do you want to force them to study that as part of a curriculum? So there is a whole child safeguarding issue here. But the other is whether you can actually, because in geography we have to evaluate stuff, don't we? We can't just describe and explain it. How long do we need to leave it before we can actually say, well, we've lived through enough of this that we can now reflect on it? Do you remember all those resources that appeared on the London Olympics, where people were trying to evaluate the impact of the London Olympics, but they were writing these resources 6 months after it finished, so they were struggling a little bit to actually articulate what the long-term impacts were going to be because they hadn't actually happened yet. So I think that is very interesting, that idea about maybe you need to wait a little bit, but for two reasons. But what would be the right length of time to leave it? 1 year? 2 years?
Yeah.
Sorry,
no,
Anna,
I think that's great, because also just even as a teacher with students in the class, there's certain things where, yes, it is like this classroom kind of feels like a safe space away from potentially what's happening outside. So maybe like a tip to students who, if you say you are interested in it and you would like to kind of look at more that evaluative one, you mentioned earlier, Simon, there's like lots of economist articles as well. So it's kind of how maybe you could use that to add to your learning as well, because not everyone will be like directly teaching it in school. So if you are interested in it, there's definitely ways where they can read about how it is impacting places or listening to something like this as well.
Exactly. And I think, again, this is another thing that the pandemic has made us all think on, as certainly as teachers and educators, is we've really focused on how school is a safe space. So the emphasis on where for some kids not being able to come to school meant spending more time in a home they maybe didn't want to for a range of reasons, the issues over meals and things, it's really made us focus on the fact that it isn't just necessarily, like my kids might think, a great thing to not have to go to school in the morning. For some students, not going to school is a really bad thing. They love school and it's a place they'd rather be. But this idea that it's a place that is safer from COVID and maybe from thinking about it is something that I'm still thinking about a lot.
Right.
Sorry.
So, turning to globalisation, and I definitely feel some of the things we'll talk about will definitely link. But globalisation potentially was in a bit of a difficult place before COVID-19. Students have learning about Brexit and potentially countries moving towards more nationalist policies. COVID-19 obviously shut down transport, flows of people. Do you think that COVID-19 has accelerated trends so much that is potentially the end of globalisation?
Great question. How long have you got? I could go on about 2 hours. Right. Can you see my slide behind me that I've put up there? I'm not sure whether we've got a copy of this we can share, but I prepared this thinking you might ask me about this. The thing about how you handle a question like, will COVID kill off globalisation, is you say, well, that's an awfully big question because globalisation is a very big thing. And I'm aware some of the students doing this are doing different courses. They're probably studying globalisation in different ways. But this picture I put up behind me is one I put together to try and pull together all of the different thinking about globalisation. That when we say, what is this thing? It's actually huge. It's political, it's cultural, it's social, and it's economic. All those things are viewed as being parts of globalization. And another way of looking at it is to say globalization is all about global network and system building through flows of people, money, resources, merchandise, ideas, information. There's this whole list of things that are globalization. And globalization is also quite regionalized. A lot of students, if you ask them about globalization, will start talking about Polish people coming to live in Britain. And what they're actually talking about is a world region and something that's going on within particular world regions. So everything we study about globalization is also often not truly global. It's happening within particular regions: South America, Central Africa, Europe, North America. So it's really difficult at the end of the day to generalize about what the pandemic is going to do to globalization. It's also happening in tandem with a whole load of other things that were going on, like China is slowing down as the locomotive of global growth. China's engine is not puffing along quite as vigorously as it was. You also have you've had Trump and some of the new populism. You've got a lot of these political forces out there, the disruptive forces of Russia, the tensions between the US and China. So even before COVID started, there were an awful lot of tensions. And I do remember reading various leaders in the Financial Times a year or two ago where they were saying globalization is not going to be able to cope with it. Just imagine if a pandemic happens. We're already at a very, very difficult point. So there is an argument you could say it wouldn't be hard to put together an evaluation where you say, yeah, globalization is going to be stopped by COVID. People can't move, goods won't be sent around as much, so it's all going to slow down. But in fact, if you then start scratching your head and look in more detail and break this down to look at the different global flows and the different areas of globalization, it's actually quite complicated. I mean, the big thing that stands out is the fact that most of the big tech companies, the big tech TNCs, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, these companies have doubled their market value since the beginning of the pandemic. Jeff Bezos, who was already ridiculously rich, is now twice as rich, because if you're very rich, it's quite easy to double your money. So these huge technology companies, we talked about this earlier, it's the same thing. There's been a step change in the companies that were doing well already, like Facebook and Amazon. They're doing even better because everything's being forced online. And more online retailing is happening. And I talked earlier about the idea about Black Lives Matter, the way I don't ever remember seeing a kind of global consciousness movement a transnational identity movement like that move in that way like wildfire in my lifetime. So you could put together an argument saying, well, okay, people can't migrate. Guest workers are going home. Remittances have slowed down. Yes, there's a bit less international trade going on, but information flows, data flows have filled that gap. So a better way, probably a smarter way to come arrive at a judgment on that one is to say that globalization is not so much over, but has moved into a new phase. Globalization 2.0, or some people call it globalization 4.0, because they reckon there were three earlier phases of this. But I think to say rather than globalization going into reverse, we're going to a new phase of it where, yes, some global flows are in reverse. Other global flows have accelerated. And as geographers, we're supposed to be a bit quantitative, so we would have to do a kind of empirical weighing up of all of that and say, well, if more digital, if there's more, if more people buy stuff on Netflix, but nobody's buying DVDs anymore, that's an economic acceleration. The other thing that's going to happen is there's a huge rebound. So we've seen an unprecedented we were saying it was unprecedented during the global financial crisis when GDP fell globally by about 3%, the UK's by a couple. This is off the scale, 20% reduction or something. Well, it'll be interesting to see what the UK's GDP falls by next year. But the rebound that comes after that could be enormous. I bet everyone that's listening at the moment, particularly those who are going to be 18 by next summer, you are going to party towards the end of 2021 like never before, probably, aren't you? Because let's face it, I mean, I know old people are saying this as well. That I know quite a few people in their 50s and 60s who are planning their parties for next summer when they think they're going to have a vaccination and it's all going to be all right again. So maybe there'll just be an enormous recovery. And again, we're back to that important idea of time in geography, that you've got to be careful about judging something as being over or done until you've got a long enough time series to be able to say, was that a fluctuation in the equilibrium? Was that really heading off into a new state? You've got to step back a little bit.
Quite a few questions have come through on that. Some short, some slightly longer.
They're saying, where's the bar?
No. You mentioned FANGs, and just a short question from Livy, just saying, does globalization include online companies such as Amazon? So really quickly, could you just explain the role of, say, like an online company, those tech companies?
Yes, of course it does. Of course it does, and it's a bit of a misnomer that transnational companies are all making things. They're just one type, like manufacturing firms. But in schools geography, we tend to do a lot of focus on the McDonald's and things where things being made. But so much of the global economy is money and information. So yes, the biggest and most important TNCs by market value and power and influence increasingly are these digital companies. And again, things are often a bit more complicated than they look at Key Stage 3 and GCSE. A lot of people say, well, yeah, but Facebook and Amazon or whatever, they're all they're quaternary companies, aren't they? Because they're in technology. It's like, well, no, they're not, because Amazon has these great big warehouses, which is tertiary industry. It's just selling you stuff. And Microsoft, I've got a Microsoft mouse. Microsoft turn out to make mice. So they're not just a quaternary company, they are selling their own stuff as well. I've got an Amazon Fire Stick stuck into the side of my telly. That's a physical thing. So yeah, they are huge global players, transnationals, and they are working in the quaternary, the tertiary, and the secondary sectors. They are all of these things. And probably some of them are sourcing the raw materials they need as well. So they're probably sourcing primary products from somewhere as well. One of the most important things for mobile phones to operate is something called rare earths, which have to be dug out of the ground. A lot of it comes from China. And if you haven't got control of rare earths, you can't make mobile phones and all sorts of other clever bits of computer kit.
Linking to social media, and actually this kind of goes back to our previous topic, but there are still some on globalization as well, saying, do you think social media and rising technologies could influence somebody's sense of place?
Oh, what a lovely question. Yes. But I think what is happening is we are a really critical point with this in terms of our common humanity and our sense of community and what's happening to us. There was a view the end of the 1990s, at the start of the noughties, called hyperglobalization, and there were phrases being thrown around like it's the end of history and it's the end of geography. There was a belief that the whole world was converging into a sort of shared global citizenship where we were all going to, through the shrinking world and power of the internet, we were all going to become part of just one big, happy, sort of lovely society, and there'd be no more conflicts and wars. We probably all speak English, but there were certain assumptions, I think, behind this world model. But there was a genuine belief that we were all going global. Now, what happened was the people that believed in that forgot to check that everybody else was on board with this until Brexit and Trump happened, certainly in the West. And there was a huge reminder that it turned out that a vast chunk of society, 70 million Americans who've just voted for Trump again, don't really want to lose their sense of community and place to the internet and disappear into the cloud of global citizenship. They very much want to be American. They very much want to be citizens of Detroit or Iowa or wherever, and they probably feel very fiercely that they want to belong to their local neighborhood and go drinking beer in their local bar still. Same with Brexit. The same forces are there, that there is this weird correlation. The more global and shrinking world we've got, where it's looked as if superficially everybody's just going to disappear into the internet, there's been a huge kickback against that. And at the same time as we've got these forces that try and draw us all together, and lose a sense of local place and identity. At the same time, loads of people are kicking back against that and saying, no, I want to feel that I belong to a local place and community. This is also why loads of northern towns have just, voted Conservative in the last election. Those political forces have been tapped into, of local communities saying, we got left behind by the Blair government and all these people that were into Europe and globalisation. They forgot about us. We're going to vote for a government that says it's going to do something for our community and bring jobs to us and to our place and look after us. So, yeah, I feel very strongly that we've got to look at this quite critically.
I know we've managed to talk on, but there's just a few questions if you're happy, Simon.
Okay.
But then if there's any,
I'm under lockdown, Ellie. I can't go anywhere or do anything. I can't go to the pub. I can't go to parties. So I can just sit and talk all
night. Sophia has said, surely China is exporting more due to like face masks and general PPE. So has China's exports, how have they changed, if you know? And then linking to that, my question is, global supply chains can obviously get impacted by lots of different countries and maybe how their national policies are going. Do you see that trade is going to become more regional instead of large global supply chains?
Oh, I love all these questions today. These are great. Right. What was the
first one? Is what China's exports? Have they had a hit, or are they?
Surely China's exports. I want to quote that film they won't have all said, which is "Don't Call Me Shirley." But I don't know to what extent does face masks and PPE trade compensate for less. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, before some of our listeners were born, there was a phase where when you went down to Woolworths, remember that, everything was made in China on the back. There was a lot of very cheap kettles and toasters that were it was the era of the 5 or 10 quid kettle for if you're a student, or toaster from China. Those are not as evident anymore. China's moved up the value chain. People are not being paid $1 a day anymore to make really cheap stuff. I think it's in Japan. Japanese economists call it the flight of ducks. Have you ever seen ducks on a wall? They have them in Coronation Street, where they're arranged, where there's a duck here and a duck there. They sort of move in formation. There's always been this theory of economic geography that the sweatshop economy, the race for the bottom, cheaply made stuff, mass-produced stuff, it used to be made in Japan a long time ago. Then it was being made in Hong Kong. The phase when it was being made in China, I believe, is largely over now. A lot of the really cheap stuff is migrated to other countries. It's Vietnam, it's Bangladesh, it's other parts of Southeast Asia. And increasingly, a lot of what you might get from China is slightly higher end stuff. And a lot of it, crucially, is made for domestic consumption in China. China's economic model has shifted where it's no longer a country where poor people make cheap stuff and sell it to the rest of the world. It's a country where a large number of middle class people earning $600, $800, $1,000 a month are consumers themselves. So a lot of the iPhones that might be made in China might be sold in China if Chinese people weren't actually buying Huawei ones instead. So I do think that there is China's GDP growth has slowed from 15% to about 6%, and it is still slowing because a lot of that was driven by trade exports that are not happening to the same degree. But it's a great point to make that maybe some of the PPE, is it being made in China though? I'm going to confess ignorance here. I don't know where a lot of the face masks come from, and I don't know whether people are being exploited making them. They're all going in the Pacific garbage patch. What was the other point? The other point was supply chains.
Will they become more regional?
There's going to be two. In Globalisation 2.0, there's actually going to be two globalizations. There's going to be the China-dominated global supply chain, and then there's going to be the US Western one. That's one theory. Is the way we're going, and it's all linked now into superpowers conflict, but as European countries, particularly the UK, under pressure from the Trump administration, but Biden is probably going to continue this, as there is this cooling of relationships between the US and China, I think we're going to see a lot more of whether it's pressure from government or whether it's companies doing it themselves because it's seen as good business, good risk management. But a lot of Western companies are going to disentangle themselves from perhaps Chinese supply chains, and they're going to set up alternative ones. Maybe it will involve East Africa more. Maybe it will make more use of India as India continues to develop. And meanwhile, Chinese companies will be building their own supply chains, maybe through countries that they've got very strong links with through Belt and Road. So I think we're moving possibly to a world where, there are science fiction worlds where there's two Earths and they're slightly in phase with each other, but they're both there. There's possibly going to be two global worlds coexisting in the same space with a Chinese-dominated supply chain and internet and a US and European supply chain and internet sharing the same space. That's another way in which globalization is perhaps changing from before. Rather than just a single world economy, perhaps we're going to have two very complex ones sharing the same space. Lovely. I love that idea. That's good job.
Probably the final question before we go on to my final question about careers from Harriet, okay. Which actually before kind of coronavirus, just generally for A-level students, students often learn about kind of community resilience to globalization. Some students, like the big case study is always like Todd Morden, etc. Harriet has said, are there opportunities for different types of growth? So opportunities for doorstep delivery rather than supermarkets, return to milk delivery or veg boxes, supporting communities and jobs. How do you think that? Do you think that, there's opportunities for community that way? If I think it kind of links to both globalization and changing places.
They're on fire, the audience tonight. Another great question. That, as every great geographer, I keep saying this tonight, as any good geographer would say, that very much depends, Harriet, on what place you're talking about. It depends on, I think, absolutely there's opportunities there, but it's going to depend on the local place, the local community, its purchasing power, its attitudes. You need a critical mass of people with any service that can support its threshold population. So if door-to-door delivery of local produce is a lot more expensive than what's coming from your Hermes courier and Amazon, you've got to have people that have the will to do it because they've got the values, the ethics, the education to know that these are issues they should care about and they're going to make a sacrifice. And then they've got to have the money, and everybody, frankly, is brassing at the moment. There are 2 million people losing their jobs or something. The big worry we've got is that as the real economic impacts hit, which is going to be when furloughing Mark II finishes in the spring, we still don't know to what extent we're going to have a massive wave of unemployment. Some places, will they be resilient enough to that there will be sufficient numbers of people who can do this? Or will they regretfully wring their hands and say, I'd really love to be able to support this, but I'm off down the 99p shop now to see what I can pick up in a tin? So, sorry to sound a bit glib there, but that is the honest truth. Is it's a golden moment to reinvent ourselves, but it's contingent on a lot of things. It will be locally variable, and crucially, I think, in geography we always think about scale. It probably can't just happen through local communities willing it into place. It's going to have to be. There's got to be a will there in 10 Downing Street. The government, Rishi Sunak, they've got to set up as part of their whole, whatever they're going to do to restructure and regenerate the UK as a whole after this, with this record-breaking amount of debt we're going to have, our debt mountain, they've got to come up with policies that encourage this. Now, if the government can engineer, I know Johnson seems to want to come up with some wonderful Green New Deal that will allow this to be a transformative moment where we do not go back to what we had before, and we do innovate and we move forward and we embrace a green agenda and climate change. Maybe that can happen, but I think it's going to be a combination of scales. It's got to be steered by government because they've got to provide the economic playing field where that can happen. They're going to have to, maybe they need to tax Amazon so Amazon can't operate as cheaply in order to make sure local initiatives like that can prosper. But then if you tax Amazon, you're going to hurt the very people who find that they're living off minimum wage or they're living off universal credit now and they can't actually afford if Amazon's prices go up. So fingers crossed, let's be optimists that there is a good future ahead.
There's been a few comments saying either one of their students is doing an NEA on globalisation, looking at the high street and looking at impacts from the economic crisis and also impacts of coronavirus. That seems very meaty, that NEA. And then another one saying they would like to link their COVID-19 in their NEA as well. So I think there's been a lot of food for thought for students and teachers listening. The final thing we ask everybody is how did you get to your career, or do you have any career or advice for students as they're kind of in those A-level years thinking about future steps?
Oh, I might not be the right person to ask about this because my career, I'll be honest, is a little bit haphazard, dilettante geographer, possibly lucky it all ended up the way it did. But geography has been an enormous friend to me as a career. And I'll just say this quite briefly, because what I do, which is write books for A-level geography students and set exam papers, is not necessarily a career that anybody watching this might actually want. I don't think anybody's watching this saying, I'd really love to be a geography principal examiner. Can you tell me how I do that? At 17, honestly, that shouldn't be your ambition in life. Think bigger. But if you're wanting me to give some advice where we think about geography and careers, there are two things to recognise. Is that fundamentally there's two kinds of geographer. Some people do geography because they feel such a strong affinity with something to do with geography, rivers, the environment. Maybe they could become a biologist, but they decide to become a geographer because they're really interested in ecosystems and management, and they want to work for the Environment Agency. And when you go and look at the Royal Geographical Society, Geographical Association, Field Studies Council, any of the big organisations in the UK that try and encourage people to do geography degrees, what they tend to do is very much focus on geography themed jobs you could do, like become a flood risk manager, become a hazards expert, maybe become someone who works in the insurance industry managing weather hazards, become a weather presenter. So they try and find all these geography themed jobs that are what we used to call vocational. You use your geography degree so that you can become a professional geographer, or you become a geography teacher or a geography lecturer or something like that. And that's great. But you know what? Only a minority of kids who do geographies do that. Only about a quarter of kids who do geography degrees at university become a geographer, in terms of doing a career where people go, oh, you must have done a geography degree because I can see you're a flood risk manager. The other three quarters to me are the interesting ones. They're the people who don't particularly want to be a geographer, and yet they want to do geography. And I think I was actually probably in that group because I tried very hard not to do geography at school. I chose ancient Greek for my O-level and then gave that up after a week and thought, what can I do instead? I'll do geography. I started my A-levels doing history, economics, and maths, and hated economics. And after a couple of days, thought, what can I do instead? I'll do geography. Then people said, what do you want to do for a degree? And I said, I don't know, I'll do geography. And then people said, what do you want to do for a career? And I said, I'll teach geography. So I seemed to be resisting being a geographer all the way, but I can look back now and I understand totally why I did it. And it's because I was never brilliant at anything, but I was quite good at lots of things. I really liked the breadth of my O-levels, which is what we call GCSEs in those days. I liked maths. I was good at sums. I liked writing English essays. I liked learning a bit about history and the sense of place you got through history. And I loved doing maps and landforms in geography, which is what I saw it as at that age. And I liked everything. And I really resented it when I got to A-level and people said, you've got to do 3 subjects now. Because I thought, well, how do I choose? Which I think is why I did a day of economics and thought, God, this is narrow. I can't do this for 2 years. And then I saw geography and I thought, oh, this is great. I can still do some maths and some English and some history. And I think geography is like that at A-level and as a degree. It's almost like a baccalaureate in one subject. It's all still there. And you know what? There's loads of learners who are like that. They don't want to specialise and become very, very narrow. They want a broad skill set. They are comfortable doing a bit of maths and a bit of science and doing a bit of argument. And geography, I used to teach I used to teach at a school called Bancrofts, and we used to start the year off with 40 students doing A-level and say, who wants to do a geography degree? And 3 people put their hands up. So we'll be a geography teacher like you, sir. And then by the end of 2 years, we'd have 15 in a good year doing it. And they were all these students who had a really broad skill set and wanted to do a very general degree that allowed them to keep doing all of these things. And you know what happens to that 75%? Well, they all go off and do really important jobs where it turns out that it's very useful to be able to understand science, and it's very useful to be able to argue a viewpoint and influence people, and it's very useful to have a sense of place history, and it's very useful to have a good sense about when something is a global issue or a national issue or local. And it's really good when somebody says to you, do you think COVID's going to wreck places, to be able to say, well, that depends on what sort of place you're talking about. I'm a critical thinker, I'm a geographer. And in my view, what I've just said, wouldn't we have a better government if they'd all done geography degrees and they all understood what the scientists were telling them because they had their quantitative skills, and they all could talk to the public and understand and think of the perspectives of different people when they're making their decisions? A world in which everyone's done geography degrees and become politicians. Law is another one. Lawyers have to have a brilliant forensic eye for facts and data and be able to spot when a number's not quite right. But then they have to be able to argue and convince people and reach a judgment. Is this all sounding like AO2 evaluation? It should do. I'm doing a sales pitch. Do your geography degree. Geography is a brilliant degree to do as a grounding before you move into some of the most important jobs in law and in politics and in powerful places in society where you need to be scientifically literate, you need to be able to argue and judge, you need to have a sense of place and a sense of history and a sense of community. I don't think you get that from a classics degree, not mentioning anyone in particular who's our Prime Minister. Might want to cut that bit out later. So that's my sales pitch and my career pitch is, if you're thinking, I really like geography, but should I do it for a degree? Because somebody's saying, all I can do is become a geography teacher or work for the Environment Agency. It's like, no. You've got completely the wrong idea about geography. Trust it. It's a fabulous A-level to take you to some of the jobs that we most need, I think, in our generation of young listeners. We need you guys to be doing to fix all the problems my generation have made. That's...
Take myself off mute. Yeah, that was fantastic. I might have to play that to my A-level students who had a good year doing A-level geography last year, A-level degrees, and not as many this year, but I feel like that was very convincing. As you said, lots of AO2 there. And if our government was run by geographers, hopefully we'd be in a bit of a better place.
Exactly. So
thank you. I don't know if you have any kind of final words that you want to say, but you have given us so much information. I really like thinking critical about the A-level course and also what's like helping students to actually understand what's going on at the moment, how that is changing places around them. So thank you so much from all of us and everybody watching. I'm sure it'll be really useful for future students watching it as well.
Oh, good. Well, all I want to say is thank you so much for having me on and giving me the time and space to talk. I haven't been teaching the last year or two, So I really like opportunities where I know I'm still able to make it, even if I can't see them, that I'm making links with students.
Brilliant.
And any students out there, thank you for your questions, and thank you so much for actually wanting to listen to me bang on about geography for an hour when you've been under lockdown in school all day, walking around with your masks on. It's great that you're following this on Ellie's fabulous channel.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for having
Brilliant.
me.
Well, I'll just let everybody know what's happening next week. So next week, just so you know, we've got 2 universities, so Manchester and Royal Holloway. So if you are interested in a geography degree, as Simon said, it's I'm not going to repeat what he said, but lots of many useful things. Then please do watch, and have a lovely week, everybody. So that'll be next week at 5. So bye from me.